Conformation refers to the shape or structure of a horse. It is the internal framework that defines a horse's appearance and movement. Studying conformation is not a new technique and is not found only with horses. Many domesticated animals compete in competitions of conformation. For example, traditional dog shows are judged on how well the individual dogs meet the conformation standard of that breed. Knowing how to evaluate conformation is a good skill to have because it affects how athletic a horse can be, how easy they will be to train, and how likely they are to become injured or lame. It is the key to why the racehorse runs fast, the jumper jumps high, and why the barrel racer is so agile. There are 5 main things to evaluate when examining a horse's conformation. These are balance, structure, muscling, travel or way of going or movement, and type or breed characteristics. Faults are split into 3 different types. A primitive fault refers to an ancestral or historical type of conformation found in true wild horses. Primitive faults, such as a short, thick neck and low withers, have nearly disappeared in domesticated breeds. However, they can still occur. These faults may be unattractive and delay progress at certain disciplines, but they are not necessarily harmful. A congenital fault is a harmful fault that the horse was born with. Congenital faults can be a result of breeding horses that have major faults, or just poor luck with certain genes and certain traits. Examples of congenital faults would be a long back or a small chest. The last type is a pathological fault. Generally, these faults are a sign of damage that happened after birth, and often are man-made due to incorrect riding and training methods. These faults are usually harmful. Examples would be a dip in the back caused by muscle strain or torn ligaments in the neck. There is no such thing as a perfect horse. Almost every trait has both good and bad qualities, and not all undesirable conformation traits means that the horse isn't perfectly acceptable and capable for riding. Balance is arguably the most important aspect to evaluate when examining a horse. Balance is essential for both quality of movement and performance in any event, and it is determined by the horse's bone structure. Balance refers to the equal distribution of muscling and weight. Balance is determined by proper angles and lengths of different parts of the body. Proper balance enables the horse to carry itself with easy maneuverability, greater power, and smoother movement. A horse should be square. By this I mean that the length of the body from the front to the back should be approximately equal to its height from the top of the withers to the ground. From the side, the proportions of the horse's shoulder, back, and hips should all be approximately equal. A horse can be divided equally only if it has a long, sloping shoulder, a short back, and a long hip. Every horse has what is called a top line along the top of its body, and a bottom line, which is along the bottom of the body. The top line of the back should be much shorter than the bottom line. The neck is the opposite. It should have a top line that is twice as long as the bottom line. After evaluating the overall balance of the horse, we will start to assess the main areas of a horse's structure. Structural correctness is critical for soundness as well as correct movement. This is determined by proper structure and alignment of the bones. Structural correctness is tied very closely to balance and influences the way a horse moves. So now we're going to look at the specific conformation on our horses here. So this is Prince, and we are going to look at the lumbosacral joint. So the lumbosacral joint is the joint in between our lumbar vertebrae and the sacrum vertebrae that's part of our pelvis area back here. So knowing where this at is super helpful because this one joint placement will make your hip longer and your back shorter. Both of those are really good things to have, and so this one joint can really help a horse to be more athletic, more flexible, all of those things that are really good. So the way that we find this is going back down his back. You're gonna feel the little bumps of the vertebrae, and then at some point it stops and it's kind of a mushy spot. And then you keep going and it gets bumpy again. So what this is, your joint is gonna be right there in that mushy spot. The reason this is the lumbar vertebrae up here point forward, and then the sacrum vertebrae back there point backwards. So in between, they're like this, and in is that mushy spot of the gap right there. So when we're trying to determine if the joint placement is good, you look at the point of the hip. So our point of the hip on Prince is right here. It's this hard, bumpy area. And in order for your lumbosacral joint to be good, it should be even with your point of the hip, or in front of it. That's going to give you a nice, long, powerful hip and a short, strong back. So Prince here has a very good lumbosacral joint placement, and so that's going to be a big bonus for him for the rest of his conformation. So now we have Wendy here, and Wendy's lumbosacral joint placement is not as good as Prince. So she has the point of her hip here, and then her lumbosacral joint is way back about here. So you can see that those 2 points are not even. Because of that, she has a much shorter hip that's not as strong, not as powerful, and then she has a back that's much longer. If you have a horse with a really long back, that is considered a major fault. A long back is very weak, and it does not do a good job of helping the horse to properly use their body. So you want the back to be as short as possible, except that it can be too short. If their back is too short, then you're going to have issues with saddle fitting, and you can have issues with their legs actually hitting each other and injuring each other. So it's kind of a fine balance between wanting to have the strength of a short back without it being too short. So looking at Leo here, he has the shortest back of any of our horses, and his back length is actually considered ideal. So this is from his point of the shoulder to our lumbosacral joint. And the way that you would measure this to determine how long or short it is, you go from the point of the shoulder, which is up here. It's harder to see with our winter coats, but it's a very bumpy area, very hard. So you go a straight line from that shoulder all the way back to their hip bone here. You don't want the back to be more than 50% of that length. So if your back is over 50% of the body length, then it's going to be considered long. Ideally, you want it to be 45% of that length, and that's what Leo has, and so his back is considered the ideal length. So for comparison to Leo's short back, we have Baxter, who has a pretty long back. And his isn't extremely long. It's not higher than that 50% of the body length, but it's pretty much as long as you would ever want to see it. If it were to be any longer, then it would be a fault for him. So again, we're going to look from our point of the shoulder. On him, you can see it a little bit better than Leo. And then we're going to follow that in a straight line all the way back to our hip bone. And then from his point of the withers, all the way back to our lumbosacral joint, That's a pretty big area on him. And so just based on that, we can tell that he has a longer back. So we already talked about back length and how it goes from the point of the shoulder up to our lumbosacral joint. But there's actually two types of vertebrae in that area. So one would be our thoracic vertebrae, which are attached to the ribs. So each one of those vertebrae have a rib that comes down, and those vertebrae are flexible. They're the most flexible of the horse's body length here, and so those are able to really move and bend around. But then further back, you have the lumbar vertebrae, which do not have ribs attached to them, and they are not flexible. They cannot move at all. So you want, in a riding horse, you want to have those lumbar be as short as possible, and you want the ribs to be as long as possible. That will make the horse the most flexible. So how would you determine this? You would measure from your 2 points of the hip, and then you find the last rib. So on Lady, her last rib comes up to about this spot. So we have 1, 2, 3 points. We have our hip, and the end of our ribs. So it actually makes a triangle on their back, and that triangle is inside would be the lumbar vertebrae, and on the outside we call this area the loin. So this is the part of her back where the lumbar is, and it cannot move at all. It's completely inflexible. So on Lady, she does not have the best loin. It's pretty long and it's pretty narrow. You would want it to be shorter and wider because that makes it stronger and it makes the ribs longer. So Lady does not have the best loin. So looking at Quinn and his loin, he has a much better one than Lady does. So if you follow his last rib and you go up, you can see it's not that far from his hips. And then from the top view, you'll also see that it's very wide. So it's short and wide. The other piece of our back that we're going to look at then is those thoracic vertebrae and the ribs. So like I said, this is the part of the horse that is flexible, and so you want it to be as long and as deep as possible. So you want the ribs to be as long as the back, as a minimum. If the ribs are longer than the back, that's considered a really good thing because it means that the horse should be extremely flexible. So on Quinn, his ribs are about 5% longer than his back. So that's a good thing. They come all the way back here. The kind of like cheat method that you can use to tell if a horse has a good rib cage is if you measure, most people, if you spread out your fingers, is about 7 or 8 inches. And you want to have less than that amount of space between their last rib and their point of the hip. So on him, his last rib is here, his point of the hip is there, and my hand width is much longer than that. Now we are going to look at the horse's neck. And the neck, for me, is a very hard piece to see because it's so muscular and it can be really hard to try to visualize where those bones are at. But it is important to try our best and see where the bones actually lie in the neck. So on horses, if you'll remember from anatomy, they don't just go, the vertebrae of the neck do not go along the top of their neck the way that you would think. They actually curve upwards at the top and then come down. And it's almost like the letter S. It's called an S curve, okay? So ideally, you want a horse to have a very short lower curve, a medium middle curve, and a long upper curve. That makes it the easiest for the horse to move correctly, to be able to really arch and stretch their neck. Looking at Quinn and his neck, again, it's kind of hard to visualize, but he has a pretty long upper curve. It comes up like this, then that medium middle curve, and then down here at the bottom, the lower curve is nice and shallow. So he has a pretty well-shaped neck, and that's gonna make him able to arch his neck and put his head down and do all the things that we want him to be able to do as a riding horse. So looking at Tank's neck structure, his is very different from Quinn's. So he has a shorter neck overall, but the upper curve here is pretty short. So the upper curve is a big piece in how a horse can put their head down and how they can tuck their head down. Because his is so much shorter, it's going to be a lot harder for him to put his head down and tuck it down. He's going to always want to have his nose sticking out like this and not want to really bend his head downward, just because that area is so short. Then if you go down further, his middle curve is kind of normal, kind of average. It's like a medium. But then when you get to the lower portion of his neck, it's very deep and wide. And that deep and wide portion down here is going to make it harder for him to properly use his neck. So this should be a big piece for anyone who's looking at a horse that they're going to buy, that they're going to train, because the higher and shallower this lower curve is, the easier it's going to be to train a horse to move correctly. So now we're going to take a look at the horse's withers. So the withers is this big bony area here, and it connects the neck to the back. So the withers have a couple important jobs. The main one is that it almost acts as a leverage piece between the neck and the back. So for a horse to move correctly, they have to have this wither piece in the middle using balance and leverage to get the back and neck to work together as one piece. So the higher the withers are, the better they work for leverage. The lower they are, the worse they work for leverage. So Leo has pretty good withers here. They're pretty high. So he's going to be able to really pick up his back and arch his neck properly to move. Another really good thing about Leo's withers is that they carry back well, which means that they come all the way down here into his back. You'll see a lot of horses where their withers stop way up here. So it's really good to have them come all the way back, because again, that works better for leverage. It helps the horse to use their back better, and it also makes the back stronger. So while withers that are high are really good for helping the horse to move correctly, they are not as good when it comes to saddle fitting, because they can be so high and sharp and bony. Then a lot of times you get saddles that rub on them the wrong way, and that can cause damage. So looking at Lady's withers in comparison to Leo, they are much shorter, much lower set, and so she is much less able to use her back and neck together. So that's not a great thing. It is a more primitive trait, so it's found more in the true wild horses like the Przewalskis and halflingers, so like Lady and Cheyenne. Those older types of breeds are more prone to having low withers like this.